The first thing Mara Voss did every morning was count the dead. Not a ritual, not grief exactly, more like inventory. She kept a list in the inside cover of a waterproof field notebook, names written in ballpoint, dates beside them, cause of death reduced to a single word or two. Fléchette. Collapse. Pulse burn. She had filled 41 pages by the time the war entered its third year, and she had stopped counting the pages because that, she suspected, would break something in her that still needed to be functional. She sat on the roof of what had been a Metro Transit Authority building in what had once been called Stuttgart, and she watched the sky the way a sailor watches weather, not looking for anything in particular, just watching, learning the grammar of it. The alien ships moved in patterns, orbital decay spirals when they were harvesting, tight geosynchronous holds when they were listening. This morning they held tight. That meant they were listening. She uncapped her thermos and drank cold coffee, and did not let herself think about what they might be listening for. Below her, in the maintenance tunnels that ran under the old transit hub, 43 people were asleep or trying to be. Her people, her responsibility. She had not asked for that responsibility, and she had not wanted it, but the previous person who had held it, a Bundeswehr major named Elrich who had been methodical and calm and very good at the job, had died 6 weeks ago when a harvester drone tracked his signal and put a fléchette burst through the building he was standing in. He had been standing in it because he was trying to get food for the group. He had been 3 minutes from the door. Mara was an electrical engineer. She had been working on a graduate thesis about magneto-hydrodynamic shielding for fusion reactors when the sky opened up, and something came through that was not a meteor, and was not a satellite, and was not anything humanity had a word for. She had a precise mind and practical hands, and a low, stubborn anger that had been useful exactly once in her previous life, when her funding was cut, and she fought her department head for 8 months until it was restored, and was now, apparently, the most valuable thing about her. She heard boots on the access ladder and did not turn. There were exactly 3 people in the group who moved that way, with that particular flat-footed economy of motion, and one of them was dead, so it was either Sergeant Kroll or it was Dominic, and Dominic would have called ahead. "Anything?" said Sergeant Kroll. There in listening posture. Edna Kroll climbed the last 2 rungs and settled herself on the parapet beside Mara with the careful deliberateness of a woman who had decided, somewhere around her 3rd decade of service, to treat her body as a professional tool rather than a personal possession. She was 61 years old. She had fought in 2 conventional conflicts and one that was not quite conventional, and she had outlasted her original unit, 2 replacement units, and a career's worth of commanding officers. She had a face like weathered sandstone and eyes that held the particular patience of someone who has stopped being surprised by the capacities of living things to disappoint and endure. She pulled out her own thermos. Hers had tea in it. She had found tea, somehow, 3 weeks into the occupation, and she treated it with the same quiet seriousness she brought to everything else. "The relay we repositioned last night," Mara said. "I need to test it at dusk. The one Percival thinks will get us killed." "Percival thinks everything will get us killed. He's been right 4 times. Mara acknowledged this with a slight tilt of her head. "He's been wrong 11 times. The odds favor me." Kroll drank her tea. Across the city, a harvester drone crossed a gap between 2 ruined buildings, low, silent, shaped like something a child might fold from black paper if the child understood nothing about beauty and everything about function. It moved without hurry. That was the thing people had trouble adjusting to early on. The aliens, the group, had many names for them. None polite, did not hurry. They had come to a planet and found it inhabited and had set about the business of harvesting what they came for with the brisk, impersonal efficiency of people picking fruit. The fact that the fruit was inhabited by entities with languages and art, and a deep, complicated love of each other was not, as far as anyone could determine, particularly interesting to them. Humanity had found this out the hard way. What they were harvesting was not immediately obvious. Not the bodies were left, scattered and cooling. Not the metal, not the buildings. Something atmospheric, the best remaining scientists believed. Something in the electromagnetic envelope of a densely populated planet. Something generated by 8 billion people living and loving and arguing and building, and dying in close proximity over a very long time. Something that could not be synthesized, only taken. The war, such as it was, had been a rout for the first 6 months. Humanity's weapons worked. That was the surprise. Not brilliantly, not decisively, but they worked. The alien ships were not invincible. They could be damaged. They could be downed. 3 had been brought down in the first week, 2 of them by conventional air-to-air munitions and 1, memorably, by a Russian naval vessel that had gotten close enough to use its gun batteries. This had inspired a global, momentary euphoria that lasted almost 3 days before the response fleet arrived, and reduced every military installation on the planet's surface to rubble in a single afternoon. After that, it was different. After that, it was this. Mara watched the harvester drone disappear behind a ruin of offices and thought about the relay she had repositioned. The idea had come to her the way her best ideas always did, sideways, in the middle of something else. She had been rewiring a salvaged power cell at 2 in the morning, Kroll asleep behind her, rain coming through a gap in the ceiling, and she had been thinking about the drone swarms. Not about destroying them. She wasn't an idiot. You couldn't destroy a drone swarm with what they had, but about confusing them. And something in the circuit she was tracing had suggested something about the way the swarms communicated, the frequency signature they used to coordinate. And she had put down the power cell and sat very still for approximately 90 seconds, and then picked up her notebook. The relay was the first test, not the whole plan, just the first question. She needed to know if the frequency worked before she built anything around it. Dusk, she said again. Kroll finished her tea. I'll have Percival ready to say he told us so. Tell him to have something useful to do with his hands instead. Pessimism is a luxury. Kroll almost smiled. Almost. I'll pass that along. The tunnels under the transit hub smelled of damp concrete and the specific human scent of people who were doing their best with insufficient water. Mara moved through them in the practiced way of someone who has memorized a space in darkness, which she had, because darkness was safer than light, and safety was the only currency that still had value. The group had been in Stuttgart for 6 weeks. Before that, a farm complex east of Tübingen. Before that, a network of cellars under what had been a small city. They moved constantly, not because they were being pursued, but because the harvester drones worked in grids, and a stationary group would eventually fall inside an active grid, and then it was over. Movement was survival. It was also exhausting, and it was taking its toll in ways Mara tracked carefully. Injuries from travel, illnesses from exposure, the quieter damage of people who had been moving for 3 years and were beginning to forget why. She stopped at a partition wall where a young man named Felix was seated with a set of headphones around his neck, monitoring a jury-rigged receiver array. Felix was 22 and had been studying to be a history teacher, and had adapted to the new world with the practical flexibility of the very young, which Mara found simultaneously admirable and painful. "Anything on the bands?" she asked. "Military signal from the east, very faint, Morse." He hesitated. "I think it's Czech, but regular. It's been regular for 2 weeks." Mara filed this. Regular signals meant organized groups. Organized groups meant someone else was still fighting in a structured way. She took a small amount of warmth from this and put it somewhere useful. "Keep tracking it. Don't try to reply yet." "Yes, ma'am." She moved on. At the far end of the tunnel, in what had been a storage room for maintenance equipment, she found Dominic sitting on a folding stool with a tablet in his lap and the expression of a man who had just done the math and found it unpleasant. Dominic Assant had been before, a structural engineer working for a firm that built bridges. He understood load-bearing capacity, stress points, the way force distributed through a system. He had turned out to be one of the best tactical minds in the group because, he explained to Mara early on, tactics and structural analysis were both about understanding where things broke. "Tell me," Mara said. "The transit hub above us is stable, but not indefinitely stable. The north section took impact damage sometime in the last 6 months, not recent but cumulative. I estimate we have 3 to 6 months before portions of it become unreliable." He paused. "If we wanted to make it unreliable faster and in a controlled way." "Show me." He turned the tablet toward her. He had mapped the stress points with the precise, loving detail of someone who spent his happiest hours thinking about the way things held together. Mara studied the map for a long time. The north section. The load-bearing compromise at what had been the main platform entrance. The way the collapse, if triggered deliberately, would funnel outward and downward. "If something were moving through the north entrance," she said. "A harvester drone in low-altitude configuration." "Yes." "What would we use?" "The shaped charge we took from the Bundeswehr cache at the farm, 2 of them placed correctly. And the tunnel we'd be in would be fine. The geometry favors us." He said this with the confidence of a man who had done the calculations 3 times and verified them twice. "I wouldn't say it if I wasn't certain." Mara nodded slowly. She looked at the map. She thought about the relay at dusk, and about the listening posture, and about the check signal 2 weeks running, and about 43 pages of names in her notebook. "Don't plant anything yet," she said, "but get the charges located and ready." Dominic looked at her with the steady, assessing look he used when he wanted to ask something, but was deciding whether to. "You're thinking bigger than just this hub," he said. "I'm thinking about a frequency," Mara said, "and what happens when you turn it back on itself." The dusk test required stillness, which was the hardest thing to ask of people who had survived by moving. Mara asked for 40 minutes of absolute signal silence from the group, and received it without complaint, which told her how much they trusted her, which felt like a weight she had no business carrying. She climbed back to the roof alone. The sky was the color of a bruise, gradient from deep purple at the zenith to a sulphurous orange where the alien harvest ships hung in geosynchronous orbit, enormous and unhurried, lit from below by the last of the sun. They were beautiful if you let yourself see them without context. She had made that mistake once in the first weeks, and it had taken her by surprise, the cold, involuntary aesthetic response to something that was killing her world, and she had felt briefly disgusted with herself, and then, on reflection, decided it was fine. Beauty didn't require consent. It just was. The enemy could be beautiful and still be the enemy. She set up the relay. It was not impressive to look at. A salvaged antenna array bolted to a section of conduit, wired to a modified frequency generator she had built from components over the course of 2 months. The modification was the key. The frequency the drones used to coordinate, she had identified it 6 weeks ago, confirmed it 3 weeks ago, and spent the intervening time refining her ability to generate and modulate it. What she had now was not a weapon. It was a question. She was going to transmit a modified version of the coordination signal and observe how the drones responded. The hypothesis was this: the drones did not think independently. They thought collectively, their individual actions governed by a distributed signal network that functioned like a hive intelligence. If you introduced a dissonant frequency, not a jamming frequency, which they had countermeasures for, but something that mimicked their own coordination signal with a calculated error built into it, the network would try to reconcile the error. The reconciliation process would require computational resources. Those resources would be drawn from active tasks. In other words, it might make them pause. Even 3 seconds of pause could be the difference between a fléchette burst and a missed shot, Between Elrich dead in a doorway and Elrich alive with food for 43 people. She powered up the generator at precisely 19:47 and transmitted for 12 seconds. The harvester drone she had been watching for 2 days, low altitude, standard grid pattern, northeast quadrant, stopped. It did not change course. It did not accelerate or retreat. It stopped in midair approximately 400 meters away, and for 7 seconds it was absolutely motionless, hanging against the bruised sky like a black paper cut. Then it resumed its pattern. Mara counted the seconds. She wrote the count in her notebook. She sat with her back against the parapet and looked at the numbers and breathed with her mouth open and let herself feel, just for a moment, the specific pleasure of being right about something that mattered. 7 seconds. She had made them pause for 7 seconds. Her hands were shaking slightly, which she noticed and chose not to address. She capped the relay, gathered her equipment, and climbed back down. She told Kroll first, because Kroll needed to know everything, and because Kroll's reaction was diagnostic. If Kroll thought it was viable, it was viable. If Kroll had reservations, those reservations were the kind worth hearing. Kroll heard the whole account. Then she sat with it for a moment in the unhurried way she sat with everything. 7 seconds, she said. Confirmed. And if you amplified the signal. Longer pause, maybe 8, maybe 12. I need more data. And the drones in a swarm, not just one. Same principle. The coordination network is distributed, so the dissonance propagates. A swarm would pause like a single unit. Kroll turned this over. She had the soldier's instinct for where a plan broke, for the variable that looked like a detail and turned out to be the load-bearing element. They'll learn, she said. The network adapts. You get one use of this, maybe 2 before they've filtered it. I know. So it has to count. Yes. What does counting look like? Mara showed her Dominic's map. She showed her the north entrance, the stress points, the geometry of the tunnel that would protect them. She showed her the shapes she had been thinking about, not just one drone in a trap, but a swarm called in, paused at the critical moment, caught in a cascade that would trigger not just the hub but the relay of shaped charges Dominic believed could be set up along the transit line. 11 charges, 11 trigger points, a domino sequence that would take out, in the best case, an entire harvesting grid. Kroll studied the map. She reached out and touched one of the stress points with one blunt finger as though confirming it was real. The signal to call a swarm, she said. Do you have it? Not yet, that's the next piece. And calling a swarm means broadcasting. They'll know where we are. For approximately 12 seconds before the charges go, yes. Kroll sat back. The particular quality of her silence, Mara had learned, was not absence but density. When Kroll was quiet, she was more present than most people were when speaking. 43 people, Kroll said. 22 of them I'd take into any fight. The rest I'd take anyway, but I want you to know the number. 22, Mara said. The evacuation route. Have Dominic confirm the load tolerances on the south tunnel. He already did. Kroll looked at her. A slow, assessing look with something in it that was not quite approval and not quite affection, but was in the neighborhood of both. When did you have him do that? This morning, while you were drinking tea on the roof with me. You gave him the map last night. I gave him a copy of the map last night, yes. Kroll made a sound that was not quite a laugh, a brief exhalation with a shape to it. All right, she said, tell me what you need. What she needed was time, materiel, and the nerve of 43 people who were tired and frightened and had been running for 3 years. She got all of it. The preparation took 9 days. Mara worked with a focused intensity that she recognized, from the inside, as the same state she had entered during the funding battle 8 months before the world ended. The state where everything irrelevant was simply not accessible to her, where she ate and slept because the body required it and spent every available moment on the problem. The problem was physics and patience, and the understanding of how a complex, distributed network processed error. It was, in many ways, not unlike the fusion reactor shielding problem she had been working on before. She found this thought funny briefly, and then put it away. She identified the call signal for a medium swarm, 9 to 12 drones, by spending 3 nights on the roof with the receiver array, cataloging every transmission she could capture and cross-referencing the pattern of swarm movements she observed against the signals that preceded them. On the 4th night she had it, a compressed pulse sequence, 17 milliseconds long, that preceded every medium swarm deployment she had recorded. She tested it with a low-power mimic transmission on the 5th night, watched 3 drones converge on a location 4 blocks east, and wrote the number in her notebook. The relay was ready on the 7th day. Dominic had the charges set by the 8th, each one placed with the careful attention of a man who understood in his bones how force moved through a system. He walked Mara through each placement twice, not because she asked him to, but because he needed her to understand the sequence, and she understood that need and honored it. On the 9th night, Kroll briefed the full group. She did not sugarcoat. That was not her style. She laid out the plan, the risks, the odds as she estimated them, the evacuation route and its load tolerances and its 2 backup options. She told them that the south tunnel would get them out, that the charges would go in sequence, that the window between the pause and the blast was tight but sufficient. She told them that Mara had built something that had already worked once, and that she trusted it to work again. She told them that the option to not do this was also a real option, that nobody was being ordered, that they had survived 3 years by making smart decisions together, and this was another smart decision together. Nobody opted out. Percival, who had been right 4 times and wrong 11, raised his hand and said, "I want to carry one of the charges." Kroll told him he'd be carrying the detonator pack instead. He said that was fine. The day they chose was overcast, which helped. The drone's optical sensors were good but not perfect in diffuse light, and every marginal advantage was worth having. They moved into position through the subtunnels at 400, each person knowing their station, Mara at the relay point with Kroll beside her, and Dominic at the charge control position at the far end of the north section. They waited. Waiting was a skill Mara had not had before the war and had since developed with grinding, necessary thoroughness. She sat in the dark with the relay in her lap and listened to 43 people breathing and said nothing, and thought about the 7 seconds the drone had paused against the bruised sky, perfectly still, beautiful and lethal and briefly confused. At 6:11, the morning grid began. She heard the drones overhead. Not acoustically, they were nearly silent, but through the vibration sensors she had wired into the floor, a faint sympathetic tremor that came from the harmonics of their drive systems. 3 drones, then 5. Grid pattern, northeast quadrant. She looked at Kroll. Kroll nodded once. Mara transmitted the call signal. 17 milliseconds. A compressed pulse that said, in the language the collective mind understood, "Converge here, something here, the task requires convergence." She counted seconds. 3, 4, 5. The vibration changed. New signatures in the floor. More drones responding called from elsewhere in the grid, redirecting to the north quadrant. She counted 8 signatures, then 11. A medium swarm, exactly as planned, drawn in by the false signal, moving toward the north entrance of the transit hub. Mara's hands did not shake this time. She noted this with distant interest. At 12 seconds, when the swarm was in grid configuration approaching the north entrance, she could see 3 of them through the ventilation gap, black shapes moving in the gray morning light. She transmitted the dissonant frequency. The pause was not 7 seconds. It was 11. 11 seconds of absolute suspension. 11 drones, stationary, hanging in air, processing the error the network could not reconcile, drawing every computational resource away from active tasks, away from threat assessment, away from flight control, holding position the way the universe holds its breath between lightning and thunder. Dominic triggered the first charge. The sound was enormous and close, and felt like being slapped by the air itself. And then the floor trembled and the ceiling trembled, and the carefully calculated cascade of 11 charges ran its sequence down the transit line in a stuttering, overlapping percussion that lasted 14 seconds and sounded, Mara thought, in the fractured clarity of the moment, like applause. The north section came down exactly where Dominic had said it would come down. She did not see it. She was already moving, Kroll's hand on her shoulder, moving south through the tunnel with the sound of the structure settling behind them and the dust coming down in sheets. Moving without running because Kroll had said, "Do not run in the tunnel, it encourages panic," and she had believed that and still believed it. Moving in the quick march tempo of someone who trusts the geometry. They came out into the gray morning 2 blocks south. She stood in the ruined street and counted her people as they came out, one by one. Felix with the headphones still around his neck, Percival with the detonator pack still in his hands, looking at it as if he wasn't sure what to do with it now. Dominic, last out, methodical even in his exit. She counted 43. Then she counted again. 43. Behind them, the transit hub's north section was a cloud of dust and rebar, and the remains of 11 drones that had paused for 11 seconds in a gray morning sky and been caught in something they had not predicted and could not, in the end, process fast enough to survive. Kroll stood beside her. She did not speak. Mara did not speak either. They stood in the dust and the silence and watched the sky for the fleet response that would certainly come, that always came, that they had planned for, the rapid exit routes memorized, the secondary position established, everything ready. Nothing came. The sky was gray and quiet. After several minutes, Mara took out her notebook and wrote the date and 11 lines that said drone, and then she closed the notebook and put it in her jacket. "That's one grid," Kroll said. "Not a diminishment, just an accurate accounting." "One grid," Mara agreed. "There are other groups," Kroll paused, "Felix's check signal." "I know. If the frequency works here, it works for them." "I know." They walked, south first, then east, then into the underground route that would take them to the secondary position 6 kilometers away. 43 people, moving in the practiced way of people who have learned to be small and quiet in a large, hostile world. Moving with something different in the set of their shoulders than they had moved with 9 days ago. Something that was not triumph because triumph required an ending, and this was not an ending, but something that was related to the knowledge that you have hurt something that believed it could not be hurt. That you have made it pause. That 7 seconds is enough. In the days after Stuttgart, they walked. There was no vehicle fuel that could be sourced safely. The harvester drones had developed, early in the occupation, a particular interest in internal combustion signatures, and driving on open roads was a good way to die, so they walked. 6 kilometers to the secondary position, which was a decommissioned water treatment plant on the southern outskirts. Then another 14 kilometers over 3 days to a farming commune that a splinter group had been operating out of since month 2 of the occupation. They arrived at night, which was protocol, and were met by a woman named Greta who ran the commune with the quiet competence of someone who had been organizing people's labor for 20 years and had simply applied the same skills to a new problem. Greta fed them. Real food, potatoes, onions, rabbit meat stewed in water with salt and the ghost of time. 43 people sat in the largest barn and ate in a silence that was not somber but reverent, the particular silence of people eating well for the first time in weeks. Mara watched them eat and felt the specific, helpless tenderness that leadership inflicts on you, the knowledge that these people trusted her, that their trust was reasonable, that she would rather die than betray it, and that betrayal was not always a choice. Percival sat across from her. He ate with methodical attention, the way he did everything, and when he had finished he looked at her and said, "It won't work twice." "I know. They'll adapt the network." "I know. So what you did in Stuttgart was a proof of concept, not a strategy." "Yes." He considered this. He had the kind of mind that found the weak point in everything, not out of malice but out of a genuine, involuntary analytical compulsion that Mara had come to understand was his way of contributing. Pessimism in Percival was not defeat, it was quality control. "Then the strategy," he said, "is to build the concept into something repeatable before they adapt." "That's the strategy." "How long do we have?" "I don't know, weeks maybe. The network adaptation rate is something I need more data on." "Then you need data." He set his bowl down. "I'll help Felix with the signal monitoring. If the check cell has independently derived any portion of the frequency signature, there may be data in their transmissions that you can use." Mara looked at him. Percival, who had been right 4 times about things going wrong. Percival, who had asked to carry a charge and been given the detonator pack instead and had carried it without complaint and brought it back without needing to be told. Percival, who was now, in his particular, granular, pessimistic way, offering to help build the thing he had been most skeptical of. "Thank you," she said. He shrugged. It was a small shrug, the kind that meant the gratitude was unnecessary because the work was obvious, and he picked up his bowl and went to wash it. Kroll had been listening from the doorway. She had a habit of listening from doorways, which Mara had initially attributed to tactical instinct. Doorways are defensible positions, and had come to understand was also a preference for observing people in the moment before they knew they were being observed. Kroll believed you learned more about someone in the first second than in the first hour. She was usually right. "He'll be useful," Kroll said. He always was. He needed to believe that himself. "Yes." Kroll came in and sat where Percival had been sitting. She had a cup in her hands, not tea. There was no tea at the commune, but hot water, which she drank with the same deliberateness she brought to tea, as though the ritual mattered more than the contents. "The drone we brought down," she said. "The fragments Dominic collected. 7 pieces, 3 of them are structural composite, 2 are sensor arrays. One might be part of the coordination transceiver." "Might be." "Dominic thinks it's a transceiver housing. He's not certain, but the geometry matches the transmission frequencies I've been studying. If it is, I can reverse engineer the specific architecture of the coordination network." "How long?" "A week if the component is intact enough to analyze. And if it isn't, then I keep working from observation data, slower but viable." Kroll drank her hot water. Outside, the wind moved through the barn's eaves with a sound like something breathing, and in the darkness beyond the barn door Mara could see the faint, distant glow of the harvest ships at altitude, steady and patient. Their light reflected off the underside of the cloud cover like a second, cold moon. "You know what I keep thinking about," Kroll said. "Tell me." "The first week, when we brought 3 of them down, 2 with air-to-air, 1 with a naval gun." She paused. "Everybody celebrated. The whole planet celebrated. 3 days of thinking we could win a straight fight. And then the response fleet. And then the response fleet." Kroll set the cup down. "I keep thinking about how fast that celebration died, how completely. And I keep thinking about the people who stopped fighting after that, not because they were cowards, but because they had believed the fight was possible, and then saw it wasn't, and the believing and losing was worse than never having believed at all." Mara said nothing. "What you did in Stuttgart wasn't a straight fight," Kroll said. "It was a trick. And tricks work because the other side doesn't expect them. But what it gave those 43 people, And what it'll give the people in that brewery when we tell them isn't the victory. It's the proof that the fight is possible if you fight the right way. The fight we can win isn't the one they expect, Mara said. No, it's the one they haven't learned to expect yet. They sat in the darkness of the barn, the wind in the eaves, the cold light overhead, and said nothing more for a while, and the silence between them had the quality of a load-bearing wall, structural, necessary, holding things up. 3 weeks later, Mara sat in a room with representatives from 11 survivor groups and a Bundeswehr colonel who had come in from the east with the kind of bone-deep tiredness that comes from fighting a rearguard action for a very long time. The room was a basement in what had been a brewery, and it smelled like something that had once fermented and something that was fermenting now, which was an improvement. She had the relay on the table in front of her. She had her notebook beside it, open to a clean page. The colonel, his name was Faber, and he was a man who had the quality of compressed spring steel, who looked like he could be broken but not easily and not without cost. Studied the relay with the expression of a man who had seen enough proposals to know that most of them were hoping, and a few of them were engineering, and the difference was sometimes visible in the hardware. "Show me the 11 seconds again," he said. She showed him the footage. A phone camera, grainy, but the pause was unmistakable. 11 drones. 11 seconds, the cascade. He watched it 3 times. "Scalable," he said. "The signal is scalable. The frequency propagates through the collective network. In theory, a sufficiently powerful transmission would pause any number of drones in range." "In theory. I've tested the principle twice. The theory is solid." "What's the range limitation?" "Current build approximately 800 meters. With the amplifier Dominic has designed, 2 kilometers, maybe more." Faber looked at Dominic, who was sitting at the end of the table with his tablet and his careful, load-bearing mind. "The amplifier," he said. "It requires components," Dominic said, "some of which require manufacturing capability. There's a facility in Munich that was producing industrial electronics. It took partial damage in the first wave, but the machine shop is intact. We confirmed this 2 weeks ago." "You've been planning this for 2 weeks," Faber said. He said it without accusation, more like a man reading a document and finding, unexpectedly, that it was longer than the cover suggested. "We've been planning this for 3 years, Kroll said from the doorway. Faber looked at her, a long look. He had the eyes of someone who had learned to take the measure of people quickly, accurately, without sentiment. "Sergeant," he said. "Colonel, you're the ones who took down the Stuttgart grid." "We are." 11 drones. 11 drones, Kroll said, "and a good engineer." Faber turned back to Mara. "Munich is a 4-day approach. The grid coverage there is heavy." "I know. I've been studying it. 4 grids, 40+ drones at any given time." "I know." He was silent for a moment. Then, "If I give you the people, what do you give me?" Mara thought about this. Not the answer, she had the answer. She was thinking about how to say it without making it sound like more than it was, because more than it was would be a promise she couldn't keep, and she had stopped making promises she couldn't keep sometime around page 12 of the notebook. "I give you a pause," she said, "long enough." He looked at her for a long time. Then he picked up the relay and turned it over in his hands, reading it the way a craftsman reads unfamiliar work, for the logic of it, for the decisions embedded in the design, for what it said about the person who built it. "How long did it take you to build this?" he said. 2 months for the generator, 1 month to isolate the frequency, 2 weeks to confirm it. "And in 3 months, you built something that stopped 11 alien drones." Paused, Mara said. "Not stop, the difference matters." "It does," he said. He set the relay back on the table. "It does matter." He looked around the room, the 11 representatives from 11 groups, Kroll in the doorway, Dominic with his tablet, Percival in the back with his hands clasped and his expression for once not pessimistic. Something else, something quieter. "I'll authorize the Munich approach," he said. "Full logistical support, whatever I have." "When?" said Mara. "When you're ready." 3 weeks. 3 weeks, he said, and for the first time since she had met him, something in his face moved. Not a smile, something more provisional than that. "Then we'll see how long we can make them pause." The Munich approach was not a battle in the way battles were described in the history books Felix had once planned to teach from. There was no front line. There was no declaration. There was no moment of heroism that could be isolated and described without the hours of groundwork that preceded it. The cold nights with the receiver array, the 12 conversations with the manufacturing facilities, surviving technical staff who had barricaded themselves in the machine shop for 6 months, and built what Mara sent them schematics for with the focused desperation of people who needed to be useful, and had finally been given something useful to do. The amplifier they produced was larger than Mara had envisioned, and more powerful than she had calculated, because the lead engineer, a woman named Holst who had been building industrial control systems for 30 years and had, apparently, been waiting for someone to give her a real problem, had improved the design in 3 significant ways that Mara understood immediately and wished she had thought of herself. "This is better than what I sent you," Mara said when they met, in a shelter under the machine shop, Holst handing her the amplifier wrapped in foam padding with the pride of someone presenting a proof. "The second harmonic resonance was inefficient," Holst said. "I rerouted it. The range on this, 6 kilometers, maybe more. I haven't been able to test it." "We'll test it," Mara said. "We'll test it at scale." What followed was 3 days of the most precise and frightening work Mara had ever done, which was saying something, because she had been doing frightening work for 3 years. The amplifier went on the roof of the machine shop building. The trigger array went in the sub-basement with Dominic and 4 people from Faber's unit who had been trained on the charge sequences. The evacuation routes were plotted, replotted, confirmed, and confirmed again. Kroll walked every route herself, and signed off on each one with the particular gravity of someone who understood that her signature was not administrative but moral. On the 3rd night, Mara sat with Kroll in the sub-basement, and they both drank Holst's extraordinary coffee, real coffee, ground from beans, the best thing Mara had tasted in 2 years, and did not talk about what would happen in the morning. After a while, Kroll said, "My grandmother had a saying. Tell me, the wolf does not count the sheep he has already eaten." Mara considered this. "What does that mean to you right now?" "It means the ships up there have counted us as a manageable problem. They did their math and decided we were sheep." She drank her coffee. "I've met their math before. Different enemy, different century. Same mistake." Mara thought about the 7 seconds, the 11 seconds. The way the drone had hung in the air, motionless, processing an error it couldn't resolve, its certainty failing in the gap between what it expected and what was actually happening. "They've never had to learn," Mara said. "Not from us. They've never been somewhere long enough to have to learn." "No," Kroll said, "and that is a fragile thing to be." They finished their coffee. Mara went back to her notebook and sat with it open on her knee and did not write anything for a long time. Then she wrote the date, and below it she wrote a number. She had been counting upward for 3 years, and tonight she turned the page and wrote 0, and then she closed the book and went asleep. In the morning, everything happened quickly. At 5:23, Mara transmitted the call signal from the amplified relay. The response was not 11 drones. It was 47. She had expected 30 to 40. The grid coverage in Munich was denser than Stuttgart, and the collective network's response to a perceived threat at the amplifier's range would draw more units. 47 was within the margin she had planned for. She transmitted the number to Dominic via the signal cord they had strung through the building, and she heard, very faintly, the sound of him adjusting the charge sequence. At 5:29, the swarm was in convergence configuration above the machine shop. She could see them through the ventilation gap. 47 black shapes against the pale morning, moving in the coordinated precision of a system that had never encountered anything it couldn't process. She transmitted the dissonant frequency. The pause was 13 seconds. In 13 seconds, Dominic triggered the sequence. It was not like Stuttgart. Stuttgart had been close and percussive and felt like being slapped by air. This was deeper. It was felt in the chest and the knees and the teeth. It was the sound of something very large being destroyed in a very calculated way, and it ran for 22 seconds. And in those 22 seconds, the machine shop building and the two structures flanking it came down in a controlled cascade that Dominic had designed to direct the force outward and upward, into the swarm that hung motionless in its 13-second pause. When it was over, the sky above Munich was empty of drones in a 3-kilometer radius. Not permanently. The fleet would respond. The grid would be rebuilt, eventually probably if they chose to. But the grid was gone now, in this morning, and 47 drones were gone with it. And the 43 people from Stuttgart and the 80 from Faber's unit and the 31 from the machine shop were walking south through the ruins, and none of them were running and all of them were alive. Mara walked in the middle of the column. She had the relay in her pack and her notebook in her jacket, and she was aware, somewhere in the back of her mind, of a sound she was making, very quiet, under her breath, not quite audible. A tune, something from before the world ended. Her mother had sung it when Mara was very small, and she had not thought of it in years, and it had arrived this morning the way things arrive in the aftermath of crisis, emerging from somewhere below memory, surfacing into the cold morning air without permission or announcement. She hummed it until she realized she was humming it, and then she kept humming it. Kroll, walking beside her, said nothing. After a kilometer, Halst fell into step on Mara's other side. They walked together in silence for a while, the three of them, and the column moved through the gray morning with the particular quality of movement that comes from people who are tired all the way down to the marrow, but have somewhere specific to go. "What do we do now?" Halst said eventually. Mara thought about this. "We find Felix's check signal," she said, "and we send them the schematics." Before Prague, there was Regensburg. The messenger came from the east on foot, which meant he had been traveling for at least 4 days and probably more. He was young, mid-20s, Mara guessed, with the particular lean tautness of someone who had been burning more calories than he was taking in for a long time. His name was Tomasz. He spoke Czech and German and enough English to explain the situation, and he had been carrying the same piece of paper folded in his boot for 9 days, which was how long it had taken him to confirm the coordinates were safe enough to approach. The paper was a schematics request. Someone in the Czech cell, the signal Felix had been tracking, had independently derived a partial version of the dissonant frequency, working from captured drone salvage, and a set of engineering instincts that Mara recognized immediately as a kindred mind, working a similar problem from the other direction. They had the frequency wrong by 3.7 Hertz, and their transmission modulator was undershooting by a factor that would have made the pause unreliable. 1 second, maybe 2, not enough. But they had gotten there. They had looked at the same problem and arrived at the same door. Tomasz sat at the table in the Regensburg shelter and drank water with the focused attention of someone who had learned not to waste it, and Mara sat across from him and looked at the partial schematic he had been carrying in his boot and felt something she did not immediately have a word for. Not pride, not relief, something more foundational than either. "Who built this?" she said. "Engineer. Her name is Novotna. She was at Charles University, Materials Science." "How many in your group?" 63. "We have a machine shop. Partial. One of the lathes is broken, but the CNC mill works. That's enough. Mara was already reaching for her notebook. The error in her frequency derivation, it's a rounding issue at the third decimal. Tell her it's not her math, it's the way the drone signal itself contains a deliberate asymmetry. The aliens built a wobble into their own coordination frequency. I don't know why, maybe it's a check against interference, but if you correct for it, the dissonance locks. She wrote the correction number and handed the paper to Tamash. And the modulator, she needs to run it at 94% of rated capacity, not full power. Full power overdrives the resonance band and the network filters it. Tamash looked at the number, he looked at Mara. That's it. That's the difference between 1 second and 11, yes. He folded the paper with the same careful attention he had given the original schematic, tucked it into his boot. Old habit. She's going to want to talk to you, he said. Tell her to get the frequency right first, then we'll talk. He almost smiled. Almost. It was the kind of almost smile Mara had come to recognize in people who had been serious for too long, not lost, just banked, stored somewhere safe against the day it would be useful again. He left at dawn. The adaptation she had feared came 6 weeks after Munich, which was faster than she had hoped and slower than she had prepared for. The collective network, she had stopped using the vague term alien intelligence and started thinking of it in the precise terms of distributed computational architecture, because precision was useful and vagueness was lazy, implemented a filter. Not a perfect filter, but a filter that reduced the pause from 13 seconds to 4. 4 seconds was survivable. It would require tighter charge sequences and shorter evacuation windows, and it would cost them more people, probably, than 11 or 13 seconds would, and that cost was not acceptable to Mara on a ledger she kept in the front of her mind at all times. But 4 seconds was not 0. 4 seconds meant the principle still worked. What it meant was that she needed the second frequency now, not later. She had been working on it for 3 weeks when Halst came to find her at 2 in the morning in the Prague library, with the expression of someone who had solved a problem they were not sure they were supposed to be able to solve. Show me, Mara said without looking up. Halst sat across from her and opened her own notebook. She had started keeping one, which Mara had noticed without commenting on, because the habit spread organically among people who found it useful, and turned it to a page covered in the dense, precise notation of someone who thought in physical systems. The filter they implemented, Halst said, it's a frequency profile. They built a recognition pattern for the dissonant signal. I know. So you can't use the same frequency twice. You need the second one. I know. I think I found it. She laid the notebook on the table. It's not a frequency, it's a timing attack. Mara looked up for the first time. The network processes coordination signals in packets, Halst said. The filter lives at the packet reception layer. If you send the dissonant signal not as a continuous transmission but as a series of micropulses, each one below the filter threshold, the network receives them individually as background noise and doesn't flag them. But they accumulate. The processing load builds. And then... The pause, Mara said. Not an instant pause, a gradual one. Over approximately 9 to 12 seconds of micropulse transmission, the processing load reaches a threshold and the network essentially freezes, like a buffer overflow. How long does the freeze last? Longer, Halst said, because the recovery is also gradual. I estimate 15 to 20 seconds. Mara sat with this. She turned it over in her mind the way she turned a component over in her hands, looking for the stress point, the place where it broke. The filter doesn't see it coming, she said slowly, because each pulse is below the trigger threshold. They adapted to a continuous signal and we switched to a pulse pattern. And when they adapt to the pulse pattern, we'll have found the third approach. Mara looked at Halst. She had worked alongside a lot of engineers in her life, in the old life, in universities and labs, and the unglamorous municipal projects that nobody wrote about. She had worked with brilliant people and mediocre people and a few who were genuinely rare in the way that certain tools are rare, precisely right for the problem at hand, not for any problem, but for this one. "This is right," Mara said. "The math on the accumulation model, let me see your derivation." Halst showed her. Mara read it slowly. She found two places where she would have made different choices, and one place where Halst's choice was better than what she would have done, and she said so, and Halst received the correction with the nod of someone who filed feedback under useful rather than personal. 3 weeks to modify the transmitter, Mara said. 2, if Dominic helps with the pulse timing circuit. He'll help. They worked until 4 in the morning, and then both of them slept for 5 hours and started again. 2 months later, the pause technology, as it had come to be called in 7 languages across 4 continents, named not for the effect it produced, but for what it gave you, the pause in which you could act, was being built in 14 manufacturing facilities by survivor groups from Hamburg to Nairobi, to a research station in Queensland that had been off-grid since the first wave and had, it turned out, survived intact and fully staffed and furious. The fleet had not returned in force after Munich. This was not, Mara believed, because they were afraid. They did not experience fear the way a human experiences fear, and she had stopped making that category error somewhere around the 5th week of studying their signal behavior. They had not returned in force because they were calculating. They were running their numbers, adjusting their models, trying to understand what had changed in the variables, and until they understood it, they were being cautious. She would not call this fear, but she would call it hesitation, and hesitation was its own kind of victory. She sat in a room in what had been a university library in Prague, which was now a planning hub for what Faber was calling, cautiously, provisionally, without the grandiosity she would have distrusted, the coordinated response. The room smelled like books and mold, and the coffee that Halst had somehow arranged to have shipped from Munich, and it was full of people with tablets and maps and the focused, functional energy of people who have found a lever. Felix was at a table in the corner with headphones on, monitoring signals. He had 17 active contacts on 3 continents. He tracked them with the methodical attention of someone who understood, having been trained to teach history, that the documentation of events while they happen is as important as the events themselves. Kroll was at the window. She stood with her tea and watched the street below with the easy patience of someone who does not need the street to provide drama, who is comfortable watching ordinary things. Mara sat at the center table with her notebook open and a schematic spread beside it, and thought about what she would do next. Not the big picture. The big picture was Faber's concern, and he was better at it than she was. Her concern was the next technical problem. The dissonant frequency was working. The call signal was being used across 14 sites with variations and refinements she had not anticipated and was learning from. But she had been watching the drone behavior, and she had seen something in the last 3 weeks that she filed under potential adaptation. A slight reduction in pause duration at sites where the frequency had been used more than twice, consistent with a learning response in the network. They would adapt. Kroll had told her that the first night. You get 1 use, maybe 2. So she was working on the second frequency. It was not ready yet. It might not be ready before the adaptation became critical. But it would be ready, because she would make it ready, because that was what she did, because she was a graduate student who had been writing a thesis about magneto-hydrodynamic shielding for fusion reactors when the world ended. And she had discovered in the 3 years since that the engineering mind does not require the world to be intact in order to function, that the specific, stubborn pleasure of solving a problem that matters is available in the ruins as readily as in the laboratory, that the joy of getting a thing right is impervious to catastrophe. This was not the same as hope. Hope was forward-looking, future-dependent, vulnerable to the way things turned out. What she had was more structural than that, more load-bearing. She picked up her pencil and looked at the schematic and thought about second harmonic resonance, and about the collective network, and about what error looks like to a mind that has never had to learn from one, and began to write. Outside, the sky was clear for the first time in weeks. The harvest ships hung at their geosynchronous altitudes, patient and enormous and unhurried. Below them, in 14 cities on 4 continents, people were building things in machine shops and basements and university libraries. The ships had come for something humanity generated, something produced by 8 billion people living in proximity, something that couldn't be synthesized, only taken. Something about density and duration, about the specific electromagnetic signature of a species that had been arguing and building and mourning, and loving in close quarters for a very long time. What they had not accounted for was that the thing they came to harvest was also the thing that made the species impossible to fully defeat. The stubbornness, the specific grinding refusal to accept a fait accompli, the engineer who won't stop working on the second frequency, the sergeant who drinks tea on a rooftop and watches the enemy with the steady eyes of someone who has seen harder things and come through them, the history teacher who documents every signal, every contact, every sign of life across a ruined world. The way a woman hums a tune her mother taught her while walking through a city she helped save, not because she has one, but because the humming is what you do, because it is the most human thing, the most irreducible evidence of a species that persists. The ships had come for that. They had not, apparently, understood what they were dealing with. They were learning now. So were the humans, faster, leaner, angrier, with the specific efficiency of a species that had been pushed to the edge of the map, and found there not an ending but the beginning of a different kind of fight. Mara finished her notation. She turned to a fresh page. She started on the second frequency.